Some new numbers on poverty in Canada come with a stark warning. If more isn't done, the food bank system nationwide could collapse.
Well, the concerning new report from Food Banks Canada says increased levels of poverty and hunger are becoming normalized in Canada.
Canada fallen so hard that the food banks don't even have food to give people out. And that's food banks across Canada being forced to cut back on their offerings because of limited supplies.
We are all suffering under a crisis of affordability and lack of affordability, and as a result, more and more people aren't able to get by and need to turn to charities like North York Harvest Food Bank and other food banks across the province to meet their basic needs.
In the past few years, the number of families depending on the food bank has tripled, limiting the food supply, which has pushed Moose Jaw's Food Bank to reduce its services, allowing visitors to stop by only once per month instead of twice, along with adjusting the amount of food given to individuals and families.
A new report out this morning from Food Banks Canada says this country's hunger crisis is worsening at an accelerated pace. The organization says there were 2.2 million monthly visits to Canadian food banks in March of this year. That's 5% higher than March of last year and nearly double the number of visits since March of 2019.
Canada is facing a growing food affordability crisis, and it's hitting regular households right where it hurts. Food banks are getting overwhelmed as demand spikes way beyond expectations, while grocery prices keep climbing fast due to inflation, supply chain pressure, and rising everyday costs. Food banks are now turning people away in some regions, and it shows just how stretched the system has become. This isn't just a small policy issue, it reflects a wider affordability breakdown where families are struggling to keep up with basic living costs.
The 2025 hunger count looked at data from the country's 5,500 food banks. The report found 1 in 5 people who rely on food banks have jobs. That's a 99% increase from 2019. The report also found that across the country, 1/3 of food bank clients are children. Food Banks Canada is calling for legislative changes to tackle the crisis, including modernizing the EI system and making life more affordable by investing in.
In one of the world's wealthiest countries, the situation feels hard to ignore. 2.2 million Canadians are relying on food banks in a single month. That's not just a statistic, it's a long line of people stretching from Vancouver to Halifax. Since 2019, usage hasn't just gone up, it has doubled in roughly 6 years. Canada has moved from isolated food insecurity challenges to a nationwide affordability crisis impacting millions.
So when there's nowhere left to turn, they turn to food banks. But if we can't provide the level of support that they need, then we're going to see some of the province's most pressing issues get worse.
Economic leadership and policy responses have struggled to keep pace with how fast living costs are rising. Here's what makes this situation even more intense. About 1 in 5 people using food banks today has a job. They wake up, go to work, put in their hours, and still can't fully cover basic food needs for their families. Think about that for a second. A full-time worker in 2025 standing in line for food support shows how much financial pressure people are under. That's not about personal failure, it's a sign of deeper system stress.
Finance Minister promised 3 years ago that he had a plan to lower food prices. Well, how's that working out? Since then, the cost of groceries has skyrocketed, with the price of lettuce up 40%, coffee up over 30%, the price of beef up over 25%. The recycled plan for a temporary rebate won't reduce the cost of a single item of food.
The idea that working full-time guarantees stability is clearly being tested in real time, and the impact on kids is something people talk about more and more. 1 in 3 food bank users is a child. A kid who didn't make financial choices is still affected by rising costs. That's a reality many families are dealing with. These are kids showing up to school without breakfast, trying to focus while dealing with hunger.
As a single mother of 4 kids, it's not easy for me.
According to Food Banks Canada, 1 in 4 Canadians are experiencing food insecurity, while nearly half of those surveyed feel they are doing worse financially than they were a year ago.
Teachers are seeing this firsthand, while broader spending priorities still move in other directions. Walking into a grocery store right now hits people immediately. Beef prices are up around 22%.
There are people who are working, fully employed, and having to access the food bank. We have seniors, we have newcomers, we have students.
Today, Food Banks Canada released its annual poverty report card, a look at the challenges facing Canadians and how well governments are responding to them.
We're not doing enough as a country to make sure people are able to make ends meet right now.
Coffee has jumped about 37%. Lettuce, a basic item, is up roughly 40%. Families that once managed weekly grocery bills are now spending over $340 just to keep essentials stocked. That's not lifestyle spending. That's survival budgeting. Wages are not keeping up anywhere close to these levels. People are working longer hours, picking up extra shifts, cutting back wherever they can, and still falling behind.
They cannot continue to meet the growing demands with the amount of food and donations that are coming through the doors. And even then, no system is designed for growth that like we've seen.
Food inflation in Canada is running higher than in some comparable economies. Even with global pressures affecting many countries, some places are still managing slightly lower food cost increases. That gap shows this isn't only a global issue. Local cost structures matter too. The problem comes down to rising costs, supply pressures, and how quickly everyday prices are outpacing incomes. It's a mix of economic forces hitting households all at once. A public promise was made by policymakers suggesting that food prices would ease and stabilize, and it was delivered with strong confidence.
But what happens when affordability is so bad in this country that suddenly food banks can't supply people with food? What does that look like long term? And this is the direct result of a decade's worth of bad policy.
It sounded like a clear economic plan, but in reality, grocery inflation kept moving in the opposite direction, putting pressure on household budgets across the country. One response introduced short-term, rebate-style support programs, but these did very little to change the underlying price structure at checkout.
Well, the food budget here has gone from $1.5 million before the pandemic to $22 million per year. So it's been incredibly difficult. And just as you mentioned, food prices have gone up at 3 times the level of CPI. And so it's been very difficult for people to be able to buy the food that they need. And when it's difficult for them to buy the food that they need, they're having to turn to the food bank. And so that increases the number of people that we are seeing. It also increases the cost that we have to be able to feed the need.
A one-time payment might offer temporary relief, but it does not solve deeper issues like supply costs, distribution pressures, or retail pricing dynamics. In economic terms, it's like applying a quick patch to a long-term structural imbalance and expecting stability to follow.
They're just raiding anywhere to get anything they can. We can't handle that, No, everyone's running out of food. There's been a lot of abuse with people that come with $50,000, $60,000 in the bank, and they just want to get free food.
At the same time, large-scale environmental spending initiatives worth billions were introduced, while many households were still struggling to cover basic essentials like food and utilities. That contrast has made affordability concerns even more visible across everyday life. There are also grocery support programs aimed at helping with essentials. On paper, they sound helpful, but in practice, the amounts are often small and time-limited, with limited impact on overall grocery inflation trends. Meanwhile, major grocery retailers continue to report strong profits during a period of rising consumer strain.
Brody Tyler Dawson goes to his local food bank about once a week to stock up on essentials. He's unable to work due to an injury, and with the rising cost of groceries, he's been struggling to keep up financially. But he says it's around the holiday season where he really feels the pinch.
Any resource with food right now is significantly helpful to anybody that is struggling with the crisis with food prices.
Canada's grocery sector is highly concentrated, with a few dominant chains such as Loblaws, Sobeys, and Metro controlling a large share of the market. This level of concentration reduces competition pressure and gives these companies significant influence over pricing dynamics. Critics argue that instead of stronger competition measures, the system has leaned toward indirect support and policy stability for major players, which some describe as corporate-friendly economic design. As a result, food banks are feeling the pressure from multiple directions. In some cities like Ottawa and Kingston, certain food support locations have had to temporarily pause operations due to supply shortages and overwhelming demand.
Volunteers at food banks across the country are gearing up for what's expected to be a season of record high demand. Food Banks Mississauga set a whopping $3 million fundraising goal for its holiday campaign, its highest ever.
Food insecurity is something that affects our neighbors 365 days a year, but it's that much more painful at the holidays when there's a societal expectation that everybody can join in celebrating the same way.
That's a major signal of how stretched charitable food systems have become when demand exceeds available donations. Food banks are designed as a safety net, but when demand rises too fast, even that safety net starts to weaken. Volunteers are reporting burnout and higher workloads, while donation levels have tightened as more middle-income households also begin to rely on assistance. When donors and users become the same group, the system loses balance very quickly. In regions like British Columbia, this shift is especially noticeable. Households that once regularly supported food charities are now using them, reflecting how quickly affordability conditions have changed. Some people even describe hesitation.
We're seeing an increase across the board. Troubling numbers include the number of children. So 1/3 of those using food banks are children. We're seeing an increase in single adults who tend not to be seen in legislative priorities. We're seeing an increase in seniors. And, one of the troubling things that we're seeing is an increase in the number of people who are employed, who have jobs, who are now turning to the food bank.
Before entering food support locations, simply because it feels unfamiliar and stressful for them. This reflects a broader economic reality where financial pressure is no longer limited to lower income groups. There have also been isolated reports on social platforms of individuals misusing food assistance systems for attention or convenience, which adds extra strain to already limited resources. Even though these cases are not the norm, they highlight weaknesses in system design during high-demand periods. At the same time, food banks continue to serve a wide range of people, including working families, students, and others affected by rising living costs.
Just imagine families that are on low and sometimes no income at all. The demand is growing so much in terms of what's happening with our economy and what's happening with just trying to survive.
Military veterans and other vulnerable groups are also among those relying on support systems in some regions, showing how broad the impact of affordability stress has become. Overall, policymakers remain under pressure to address the gap between wages, pricing, and real living costs. While compensation and policy decisions move in one direction, household budgets continue to feel the weight of inflation in everyday life. The core issue remains economic imbalance between income growth and rapidly rising essential costs.
Young people are turning to food banks. Between February and April of this year, 1/4 of those aged 18 to 24 went to a charity because they didn't have enough money.
Fuel costs are climbing, heating costs are climbing, and anything tied to transport and energy is getting more expensive every step of the way. And here's the key chain reaction. When it costs more to move goods across long distances, those extra expenses always land on the final grocery bill. So when lettuce, meat, or basic goods are shipped across the country, transportation costs quietly stack into the price people pay at the checkout. This is how inflation spreads through the system step by step until households feel it directly in their weekly budget. Public programs like school meal initiatives have been introduced with strong public attention and visibility. They often look good in announcements and media coverage, showing kids receiving meals in school settings. But on the ground, reports from educators and school staff often point to uneven coverage, limited funding, and gaps in access for many students who still need support. That creates a gap between what is shown publicly and what is actually delivered in daily school life. Many families feel like they are seeing more announcements than real relief at the store.
It's been a problem for communities from coast to coast to coast, but it does shock me to see the number of people who have jobs coming to food banks. That's a real concern. You know, we polled and saw that it is every sector, every type of job, from construction to receptionists. Like, folks are needing to stop at the food bank on their way home from work rather than the grocery store. And it's really shocking to see just how far people are falling behind every single month. And as you said, this is becoming the new normal in Canada, and it can't be. We need to see this number reverse next year.
At the core level, the economic fixes needed are not overly complex in theory. Stronger competition in the grocery sector would help reduce pricing pressure. Right now, a small number of large retailers dominate much of the market, which limits competitive pressure on prices. More room for smaller and mid-sized competitors could help push prices down through real market competition instead of relying on short-term interventions. Another major factor is energy and fuel costs. When fuel prices stay high, every step of the supply chain becomes more expensive, and that increase is passed straight into food prices. That's why transportation policy and energy pricing have such a direct effect on grocery bills. Wage growth is another piece of the puzzle. If wages do not rise in line with the cost of living in 2025, households fall further behind, even if they are working full-time. On top of that, social support systems are under pressure. Food banks, which were originally designed as emergency support during short-term crises, are now being used regularly by many households. When emergency systems become part of monthly survival planning, it signals that long-term affordability pressure is not easing.
There's one report that came out recently, which pretty much represents how Canada feels about itself and how far it has fallen. So Canada, according to the World Happiness Report that came out just recently, sits at 25th place, which is Canada's lowest ranking since the survey began. And keep in mind, in 2015, Canada was 5th place on the entire planet.
In Canada, around 1.3 million children are affected by food insecurity. That means a significant number of kids are growing up in households where food access is not guaranteed every day. This doesn't just affect daily life, it also impacts concentration, learning stability, and long-term development outcomes. When basic nutrition is inconsistent, it becomes harder for children to fully participate in school and daily learning environments. Economists often point out that this kind of pressure can create long-term productivity challenges across a generation if it continues. A lot of frustration among households comes from what they see in daily life versus what they experience at the checkout counter. They see grocery companies reporting strong profits during high price periods. They also see large-scale public spending programs and corporate incentives happening at the same time. And meanwhile, their own budgets feel tighter each month as prices rise faster than income. That growing gap between income and living costs is the central pressure point in the current situation. Canada has strong resources, infrastructure, and economic capacity, but the challenge lies in aligning income growth with the rising cost of essentials. Without that balance, pressure on food banks, households, and public support systems is likely to continue. And the key economic question moving forward is how quickly real affordability can be restored in everyday life before pressure builds even further. And that's the situation for today on Yesterday Canada. If you want more updates like this, drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next.